Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. This is a hearing between indigenous defenders from Russia and Lawlor, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. We also have a special guest today because we are going to speak a lot about climate change. Mr. Ian Fry, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, has also joined us. My name is Nasya Kovalevskaya. I work with Special Rapporteur Lawlor, and I have the honor of moderating. So welcome. Mary, would you like to say a few words of welcome to all participants?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for giving us your time today to be present here in very difficult circumstances for you, of which we are very sorry about. But the mandate really wants to support you in whatever way we can. And I'm also delighted that Ian Fry, the other special rapporteur, is here too. Just to let you know very quickly, the mandate on human rights defenders is mandated to follow trends, to seek the implementation of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And to do that, what we do is we try and take up cases of human rights defenders wherever they are and raise their cases with the government. And if it is a case of business and human rights, with companies as well. And we seek answers to our concerns. We get them sometimes, we don't other times. The other thing we do is we do 2 reports every year, one to the General Assembly and one to the Human Rights Council. And there are also 2 official country visits a year. But the main thrust of the mandate is advocating on behalf of human rights defenders and bringing their voices to the international community. And I always feel very inadequate when I see the challenges that human rights defenders are facing and how little I am mandated to do. So I hope you bear that in mind, but very happy to be here, very happy to learn, to listen, and to raise your cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Mr. Fry, would you like to say a few words as well, if you wish?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to listen. I've come here to listen. As you can see from the background image behind me, I think people might be familiar with this. It was drawn to my attention at the climate change COP that the installation of wind turbines on Sami land is a major issue, and free, prior, informed consent was not granted for the installation of these wind turbines. So this is where the intersection of my work as a Special Rapporteur on climate change connects with human rights defenders, and actions to address climate change should not impinge on the rights of indigenous peoples and environmental rights defenders. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very keen to hear what people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both of you. So how we're going to proceed is we will first hear from human rights defenders, and I would like to ask everyone once again to keep your contributions to 4 minutes, because we have many speakers and we want to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. We will then turn to special rapporteurs for any comments they have, any questions they have to defenders, and we should have about 20 minutes for that. And finally, dear journalists, we have several media outlets on this call. As agreed, you may use information and the defenders' quotes, but if you have any questions, please contact us after the event and we will connect you with the defenders that interest you. Right. So the participants of today's meeting, they come from very different backgrounds, from different places, and they work in different areas of human rights. But one of the things that unites them is a high-profile climate change case before the Supreme Court that they started. I would like to invite the first 3 speakers to tell us more about this case how you started this initiative, what stage it is at now, and what was the government's reaction to it. The first speaker in my list is Ms. Daryana Griznova. So Ms. Griznova, please go ahead if you're ready.
Thank you. Dear Madam and Mr. Rapporteurs, dear all, my name is Daryana Griznova and I am a Russian qualified lawyer and one of the lawyers representing the clients in the first climate case against Russia. I will briefly speak about the case and then about the challenges I face in my work. We started to build this case almost 3 years ago. Unfortunately, from the very beginning, we didn't hope to win domestically because the Russian economy is very much dependent on fossil fuels, and Russia was and is choosing to delay an ambitious transformation of its economy. However, it's not unusual to take important litigation in Russia, knowing that you are likely to lose at the domestic level. My colleague Grigory will speak more about our legal strategy. Another aim of our case was and remains to raise awareness in and outside Russia of climate change and Russia's policies on the issue. My colleague Konstantin will speak more about our media strategy. I'm really proud that this case was launched in collaboration and consultation with a wide group of climate and environmental activists and defenders, lawyers, scientists, journalists, NGOs, and indigenous communities. Unfortunately, not all applicants could join today's meeting, but I would like to highlight the diversity of the applicants. They are from various regions all around Russia. The group of the applicants also includes members of indigenous communities. Each applicant has unique and interesting background and experience. For the last several years, I have also been working on women's rights, litigating violence against women cases, and writing on the issue. My work is conducted within the oppressive context in Russia, with Russian authorities taking measures to silence opposition and civil society voices. The brutality of the crackdown increased after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Currently, I'm also involved in anti-war activism. My partner, a human rights lawyer working on high-profile cases in Russia, and I had to flee Russia for security reasons. However, we keep facing various difficulties. Each time I return to my new home country, which is Georgia, I do not know whether Georgian authorities allow me to cross the border or not. Each time I'm waiting for an hour or so at the border for the authorities' decision. My partner has already been arbitrarily deported once, and his residence permit request was rejected. And on this Monday, the Georgian court upheld this refusal. Now I live without any visas, and I cannot travel for work because, for example, I cannot apply for a Schengen visa from a third country. Even with the invitation from one of the UN treaty bodies, I recently received the refusal, and I'm quoting, "Russian citizens need to contact our embassy in Moscow. We do understand the situation. However, at this time, we cannot give you another answer." And this is a common problem of almost all human rights defenders, which should be addressed. To conclude, I want to stress the importance of the international bodies and international community in helping to support and amplify voices of those who have taken a personal risk to challenge the Russian government. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Griznova. I would like to invite Mr. Grigory Vipin to continue.
Good morning, honorable rapporteurs, dear colleagues. My name is Grigory Vipin. I'm a Russian human rights lawyer. I will follow with a brief overview of the substance of our climate case. As was already mentioned, this is the first climate case in Russia. The lawsuit challenges Russia's official greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for 2030 and 2050. Why is this lawsuit important for Russian domestic discourse as well as internationally? Because it is first and foremost a statement. Climate action is a legal duty. For years, the Russian government and pro-government experts have advanced the narrative that international law on climate change, including the Paris Agreement, is merely exhortative, that states are free to set targets for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions at their own discretion. Our lawsuit challenges that false narrative. We rely on expert analysis to demonstrate that Russia's climate action is contrary to its international law obligations, is critically insufficient to limit global warming to the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. In fact, Russia's emission targets are ridiculous. Emissions are set to rise until at least 2030, and then followed by only a modest decrease by 2050. This is contrary to the plain meaning of the Paris Agreement, as well as to the conclusion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that emissions must peak no later than 2025 and then reduce rapidly. We should not forget that Russia is the fourth largest emitter in the world. If Russia keeps its current targets, then global temperature will rise by 4 degrees by the end of the century, with catastrophic consequences. In the lawsuit, we not only ask the court to invalidate the targets set in the government's policy documents, we also ask the court to order the government to set new Paris-compliant targets. And we provide those targets, those numbers, by reference to the expert report. So this is why this lawsuit matters, because the message at the heart of it, that climate action is a legal duty, that climate action targets is something a court can verify and quantify. This is something groundbreaking for the Russian legal and policy discourse, and it also contributes to a stream of other similar cases around the world. The very fact of bringing that lawsuit helps shape public opinion. So where are we standing now? A judge at the Supreme Court of Russia dismissed the lawsuit summarily. It held no hearing, it examined no evidence, it simply stated in a 3-page decision without any substantiation that the policy documents we challenge do not affect the human rights of the applicants. And this is despite compelling evidence that Russia's climate inaction is already violating a number of basic human rights, such as the right to life, the right to a good environment, the rights of indigenous peoples of Russia, as well as other rights. Last summer, Moscow was again cloaked in smoke from wildfires. The thawing of permafrost in the Russian north endangers infrastructure. And our expert report estimates that more than 700,000 people will die prematurely if Russia does not change its climate policy. We are currently challenging the dismissal decision before the Supreme Court. Now we are about to file our final domestic appeal. Should the dismissal be affirmed, we will apply to the European Court of Human Rights. While Russia ceased to be a party to the European Convention on Human Rights, this case still falls under the jurisdiction of the Strasbourg Court because it was launched while Russia was still a member. So the case will proceed, and it will add to a number of other climate cases currently pending in Strasbourg. The European Court has not decided any climate case in its history yet, so we're hoping to contribute to this momentum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vipin. Mr. Konstantin Fomin will be our third speaker on this issue. Please, the floor is yours.
Greetings, my name is Konstantin Fomin. I have worked as a media coordinator for Greenpeace Russia, Climate Action Network, and OVD Info. Helped create Fridays for Future Russia, and now I am in charge of the media campaign behind this first climate lawsuit in Russia. Climate change has traditionally been quite difficult topic to communicate with Russian audiences because the country's economy is dependent on fossil fuels, and for years climate activists had to use more, I'd say, accessible narratives to get attention, like air pollution in large cities, or indigenous rights, or wildfires. Once a year, the media was interested in this topic during the COP conferences, but only they were mainly attracted to economic issues. And it has changed only because of Fridays for Future, despite quite small scale of protests in Russia. Only 100 young people protested on the streets in Russia. Greta Thunberg and her movement was discussed by, let's say, the whole country. And after that, young Russian activists participated in COP conference in Madrid and spoke at the press conference with Greta Thunberg. The speech of one of the activists was projected on the UN building in New York. So media-wise, it was quite a breakthrough. But unfortunately, COVID pandemics and the war in Ukraine, which are really terrible on their own, have also other consequences. They diverted attention from climate crisis. And even people who understand that the dangers of climate change think that this is a threat of the distant future, and war and pandemic are dangerous right now. So the attention was on these issues. The second thing is that the pandemic made Fridays for Future street protests impossible in Russia, and even after the quarantine was lifted, Russian authorities maintained a ban on street protests. So it was quite harmful for the movement. And also, I want to mention that during the war, pressure on the environmental organizations and on their media work increased. So more of them were named foreign agents and forced to close. And large organizations such as Greenpeace limit their work a lot to continue operating country. But even in such difficult conditions, our unprecedented lawsuit turned out to be quite interesting to both Russian and international media. And despite the fact that we actually slipped between the deaths of the British Queen and mobilization in Russia, more than 50 media wrote something about us, including such prominent as The Guardian and the largest Russian language independent media, Medusa. But pro-Kremlin media and politicians also responded to our lawsuits. Telegram channels with hundreds of thousands subscribers and several members of Russian Federal Parliament, including the leader of one of the quasi-oppositional parties, accused our team basically of treason and participation in war on the other side against Russia, and called the authorities to deal with this campaign. So summing up, I'd say that forecast for campaigning and media work in this field in Russia, it is quite disappointing, and it will be harder for us to fight climate crisis in such circumstances in the next few years, because the pressure on independent media is increasing. Attention of media and of audience is captured by war, and authorities are reacting very aggressively. Therefore, support of the international community now is not only essential, but more important than ever. If you will need some more information after this call, I will be happy to provide it. And I think that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to all of you. And the next two speakers will address the overall situation of the environmental human rights defenders, the climate in which they operate. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Vitaly Servetnik. Mr. Servetnik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Madam and Mr. Rapporteur, dear everyone. I'm Vitaly Servetnik. I'm an activist from Murmansk. I was involved in environmental, human rights, LGBT and other types of activism for almost 20 years. Now I represent the Russian Socio-Ecological Union EHRD program. We are the national network of diverse environmental groups, experts and activists. And since 2012, when the foreign agent legislation was introduced, we monitor conditions for and pressure towards environmental NGOs and later also individuals. For the last 3 years, we have been publishing monthly reports of HRD cases. Therefore, I will give an overview of the situation with the HRDs in Russia. I have to draw two important lines for the content. Since the year 2000, we have been seeing two main trends. First one, similar to the human rights and political activists, is shrinking civil society space. Another one, specific to the environmental defenders' work, is softening of environmental regulation. One of the first Putin's decrees was abolishment of Goskom Ecologia, an independent environmental protection agency. Since then, every year, less regulations for the polluters, more restrictions for the environmental defenders. This continued after each crisis, sanctions package, COVID pandemic, and last year again. 70% of the population in Russia is concerned about the environmental situation. The recent polls show that. But it is clear that the current Russian state is not able to protect people's environmental rights, and on the contrary, those who are bravely trying to defend these rights against combined economic and political power are being persecuted in many ways. First of all, the institutional fabric of the environmental movement suffered from the foreign agent law. Now, already 36 groups and 2 individuals were labeled as foreign agents. 25 of them were closed because of that. 5 more groups were added last year. Leaders of both recently added groups and our members also. Arkhangelsk Environmental Movement 42 and Sakhalin Environmental Watch already announced its closure. Alexandra Koroleva from Ecodefense faced criminal persecution because of the foreign agent law. She will be speaking later about it specifically. Every year, we see at least one death of environmental defender in Russia. In 2022, Andrei Garayev, a leader from the movement Poltavskaya against the landfill in Krasnodar region, committed suicide after receiving a fine of 32 million rubles. It's over 400,000 euros. We haven't seen a proper investigation of this case, as well as in other cases. Last year, we documented also 19 cases of attacks and 5 of property damages of the HRDs, most of them for the clashes at the sites with private guards or police, but also activists were targeted at their homes or their cars or windows were damaged, etc. Last year, we observed 16 criminal cases against environmental defenders, with 9 sentences, of which 7 with real terms. Among other accusations, fraud is commonly used now to avoid political articles. We see an increase in focus on the protected areas workers, the remaining pristine areas in Russia. Also, indigenous people are more targeted for environmental protection, and my colleague will specifically talk about it also. We currently have 5 active cases of forced psychiatric treatment of environmental defenders in Moscow, Yekaterinburg, Voronezh, and 2 in Bashkortostan. It seems it's almost impossible to protest in Russia now. But for doing so, at least 15 environmental defenders were detained for 161 days in total. And also they received fines for over 1 million rubles in total. My colleague Lyubov will cover the pressure on the HRDs for their anti-war stance. But we already seen how corporations like Rosatom, State Nuclear Corporation, used the new army discrediting legislation to silence its critics. Another our member, nuclear physicist Andrei Zharovsky, was called to the police for commenting on the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In the end, we understand that the current economic system will not show us an ease in demand to the destruction of nature and violation of people's rights in the search for profit. But I want to end on the positive note. Despite this horrible situation, we see that environmental defenders don't stop their fight. Yes, some left Russia, but most of the defenders remained in Russia and keep defending their lands and rights. In 2022, we had 17 successful cases when activists managed to defend their rights. So we will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Servetnik, and thanks particularly for ending on a positive note. I would like to hand it over to your colleague, Ms. Lyubov Samylova, to continue on this issue.
Добрый день всем. Меня зовут Люба.
Good morning, my name is Luba. I'm environmental activist since 2019, and I've been doing this actively for over a year but from the beginning of the pandemic, it's become much harder because of the restrictions on mass rallies and manifestations and protests. I think that our movement has managed to make the narrative on climate change more public, but unfortunately, I practically do not do climate activism at the moment because I have transferred all my focus on human rights defense, supporting people in detention or experiencing repressions. I collect donations. I also talk about their persecution. So when I was offered to take part in the litigation against the Russian government, I felt that my two identities have been combined and I could focus on both. I can't say that I feel some great difficulties in my work because of my participation in the litigation. I just want to point out that according to the environmental organizations, I can see that even if the European Court of Human Rights will recognize these violations on the part of the Russian state, there would be no changes that would follow, because now they even refuse the payment of compensations that have already been ruled on by the European Court of Human Rights. So unfortunately, I cannot say that the Russian activists do not experience difficulties. They do for their environmental activism, for their civic stance. Over the past 6 months of the war, 37 environmental activists have been subjected to repression and persecution because of their anti-war protests and activities, or because they stated their anti-war position. 6 spent time under administrative arrest and spent over 70 days in the detention centers, and the total sum of fines was 755,000 rubles. At the moment, families of anti-war environmentalists are being persecuted by criminal cases under the articles on spreading fakes and discrediting Russian army and calling to terrorism, even calling to terrorism. And part of the cases are being investigated, are already considered by the courts, but there is already one sentence. And since 2014, Roman Tikhanov was actually charged with under article of using violence against police, although police used violence against him. As far as I'm concerned, I also spent time under administrative arrest. There have been investigations, there have been searches for my environmental activities, so I had to leave Russia after those events. I moved to Germany, where I, in fact, encountered some bureaucratic problems, unfortunately, which turned into a criminal case under the article of violation or non-observing of immigration regulations. Since that time, however, the international community has supported me, and now I'm trying to support those environmentalists who are being repressed or persecuted, write letters, look for legal aid, and also tried to inform, raise public awareness of what is happening, because support of environmental activists is very important. I would like to for as many people as possible to join this struggle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Samilova. And I really thank you indeed to all of you. Among today's participants, there are 3 defenders of the rights of indigenous peoples, and we would like to invite them to speak next. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Vyacheslav Krechetov. So I would like to give the floor to you.
I was born and have been living in Kemerovo, and there are huge areas of nature are now uninhabitable, and that is coal mining. I'm the operator and the director and make documentaries about the violation of nature, the violation of rights of indigenous people. The Kemerov region is the south of Western Siberia. Half of all the coal mined in Russia is being mined here. In 2022, it stood at 250 million tons per year. According to Russian expectations, the volume of coal mining by 2025 is going to grow 1.5 times. Almost half of it is mined in open mines using explosives, and very often this happens at the distance of 300-400 meters from housing, and it turns huge areas into lifeless moonscapes. And yet, in terms of methane emissions, we are the absolute leader among the regions of the Russian Federation. 1,865,000 of tons per year being emitted. This is 10-fold as compared with the average in the country. But this is only counting all the emissions with the underground mining. Open cast mining is not even encountered. So you could actually multiply it by 2. So we have 6 tons, 320 kilograms of toxic materials per person in Kemera. Every fifth pregnancy has abnormalities as a result of environmental pollution. So we have 2 indigenous peoples, Aleut and Shorts. The Shorts settlements and the history of it, which were destroyed by coal mining enterprises, became the focus of the United Nations Committee on Racial Discrimination investigation. But the Russian government has not done anything following its recommendations. Moreover, people who appealed to the United Nations have been repressed and persecuted by the government. Again, in our region, both the government and the subsoil users do not use the principle of free, preliminary and informed consent of the indigenous peoples. Despite the address of the shore activists, the administration of the region doesn't want to create areas for the traditional use of nature or management of nature, and the Aleuts cannot use their own lands. They cannot follow and conduct traditional activities or traditional earnings. So the shore have reduced by 18%, and there's hardly anything left from the Aleut. Only 10,000 plus short sea and 241,000 Aleuts left. Sorry, 2,400 Aleuts left. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Mr. Kretchetov. I would like to invite Mr. Dmitry Bereshkov to continue on this topic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to add to Vyachlav's presentation that he didn't mention, due to his modesty, that the police also repressed him not once. He was jailed, interrogated, and experienced smear campaigns for his work as journalist, as he shoots violations of indigenous people's rights by coal companies. My name is Dmitry Bereshkov. I am an indigenous Itelmen person from the Russian Far East. Throughout all my career, I have been involved in indigenous rights work. In 2011, because of the repressions from the Russian Security Service, FSB, I have to move to Norway, where I received political asylum. Today, I work as the editor of the Indigenous Russia webpage. Every day, we write about indigenous peoples in Russia, and in most of our articles, unfortunately, we have to raise the topic of indigenous rights violations. The Russian government doesn't like us. It fights against the truth by all repressive means. For example, this summer, during the session of the expert mechanism on indigenous rights in Geneva, after I made a statement against the act of intimidation of my indigenous colleague, Yana Tanagasheva, who was threatened by Russian diplomats just in the UN building, the Russian government banned our webpage. It is now inaccessible to readers from Russia who don't use VPNs. And of course, most of rural indigenous populations don't know even what VPN is. As an example of topics we cover as the indigenous media, I would like to tell you the story of Sergei Kichimov. Sergei Kechimov is a Khanty indigenous person who lives near the sacred lake Numto in Khanty-Mansiysk Autonomous Okrug. This region is the most oil-rich in Russia. One of the biggest Russian oil companies, Surgutneftegaz, has been extracting oil near the lake since 2012. The lake is sacred for Khanty and all indigenous populations in the region. Since then, since 2012, Sergei Kechimov has been trying to protect Khanty's traditional land against oil pollution near his house. In 2017, after a conflict with oil workers, whose dog killed his reindeers, Sergei Kechimov was sentenced by a local court for threatening oil workers. At the beginning of December 2022, just last month, he was sentenced again for threatening oil workers with 6 months of liberty restriction. Just 2 days later, after the court decision, he was again arrested by the local police, which blamed him for police disobedience. Today, he is under criminal investigation for that case. That means he could be jailed for a long term in jail, considering that the court twice convicted him previously. The other example is from the Arctic Taimyr region. Indigenous peoples have been living in Taimyr for generations. Today, Taimyr is a region where Russian mining giant Nornickel mines nickel, copper, and platinum. Nornickel is among the major polluters in the world. For example, according to Greenpeace, in 2018, sulfur dioxide emissions from Nornickel amounted to more than half of all Russia's sulfur dioxide emissions, or twice the total amount of the same emissions in US. In 2020, Nornickel made an oil spill during which more than 20,000 tons of diesel oil spilled in the local rivers, which are the primary source for indigenous fishing. The reason for the accident was both melting permafrost under the oil tank because of climate change, as well as the old equipment that Nornickel's employees operated negligently. Sorry. I will give you details of this case. I will not give you details of this case. It was widely described in the media. After the accident, Nornickel announced an investigation and assessment of the negative influence of the oil spill in the environment and indigenous communities. We consider these actions as cheating because all assessments were implemented by Russian research institutions dependent on government and paid by for Nornickel. For example, we have evidence that the evaluation interviews with indigenous fishers were not confidential, but controlled by Nornickel's representatives. There is much other evidence of unfair Nornickel's activity and pressure towards the indigenous peoples. For example, Nornickel has engaged in further negotiations with indigenous communities. Mr. Alexei Tsikarev, the ex-member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and Ms. Antonina Gorbunova, a current member of the UN Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Rights, as international and independent experts. At the same time, we know them as agents of the Russian government, whose task is to promote Russian state propaganda internationally. Furthermore, later when some local indigenous communities leaders tried to argue with Nornickel on the assessment and compensation processes, they were repressed in one or another way by local authorities, which are controlled in Taimyr by the same Nornickel company. For example, police made an armed raid to the local IP community and confiscated reindeer meat stocks, which were winter food for the whole community. After the attack, police officers mentioned that the inspection was made because some of the community leaders conflicted with Nornickel. I want to end my presentation with the final example of how human and indigenous rights, environmental issues, and climate change are closely connected in Russia. Today, the Russian State Nuclear Energy Corporation, Rosatom, promotes constructing small nuclear power stations to extract natural resources on indigenous territories in the Arctic regions. They dream of selling the technology further to the global south as a green remedy against climate change. Leaders of one of the indigenous communities in Chukotka asked for our support as indigenous media to stop this project, which threatens their traditional economy and style of life. But unfortunately, after we made the only meeting to discuss the strategy, the local FSB officers who tapped the phones of local activists, met them and frightened them by jail. So they became totally silent and didn't answer further requests. Madam Chair, these were only few examples, but we have much more. I believe our lawsuit will be an important instrument to highlight and promote the topic of climate change in Russia and ask for your support in it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Bereshkov. The next defender we are going to hear from is Mr. Andrei Danilov. Mr. Danilov, you may start.
Good morning. My name is Andrei Danilov. I'm a Sami. For the indigenous peoples of the world, there's an obvious connection to nature, to our earth. Nature is, and indigenous peoples are just one single entity. The damage done to nature is our pain in the heart. Our entire existence, livelihoods have been linked to nature since the beginning of times. We try to preserve everything that was inherited from ancestors and pass it on to future generations. Over the past 20 years alone, the number of Sami in the Murmansk region has decreased by 23%. Industrial companies develop our territories, and Norilsk Nickel and Rosatom will soon begin developing the Kolmozerskoye lithium deposit in the Murmansk region where we live. This deposit is located on the lands where reindeer farming is now in progress, and these lands will be lost to my people forever. Since the Russian defense industry needs now this metal, there is no hope for Russia to comply with international law due to the war in Ukraine and the situation inside the country. Another example, for example, the Federal Resources Joint Stock Company. This company has already stated that there are no traditional activities on these lands, which is not true. The company said in its plans that it will carry out a social and environmental impact assessment in accordance with international standards and requirements of the National Finance Group, which is not the case. So far, my people has been involved in this process, and I'm sure that the Sami voice will not be heard, unfortunately. I submitted an application for the formation of a territory of traditional nature, like preserved protected area, in terms of the use around this tundra area. But neither the regional authorities nor the federal authorities have ever given an exact answer. And a third example can be cited here as well, the transformation of the Seydozero Nature Reserve. It is a sacred place for us, where the Sami people hold their rituals, where our sanctuaries are located. And already now we have repeated cases of the Sami being denied access to our sacred places. The Sami are given a small piece of land that is not suitable for reindeer breeding. We have written a letter to the presidents, and by the way, at a meeting with local residents, the local people also spoke against it. How do industrial development projects in Russia get approved by indigenous peoples? Unfortunately, they're not asked to contribute. I know from my own experience how the principle of obtaining free, prior, informal consent from indigenous peoples is respected. We see pretty pictures and words that are at variance with deeds. For example, I was involved in development by Norilsk Nickel company of their policy with regard to indigenous peoples. But when consultations were held, this policy had already been adopted by the company. So it was an imitation of agreement with us. What else is not but a deception and a farce on the part of Norilsk Nickel? And there is plenty, a wealth of such examples. The long 3 years of but we don't stop. We continue to fight for lands. But there's been a success story as well. My lawsuit concerning the traditional livelihood of hunting, for example, was one. And I mean, and unfortunately, as I was persecuted and I was administratively apprehended as well on false grounds, which was a very hard decision for me to leave the country. But I did not leave. So my the land of my ancestors, the country. I'm here in also in the land of Sami in another country. Now, looks like I'm going to be deported to Switzerland, but there are no there's going to be no roots, no connections in living in Switzerland. So if the land of Sami support me, but it is. I think that this is so this part of the indigenous people that gives me this hope. Indeed, yeah, I cannot tear any my connections from my people, and I want to end with the words from the movie Kautoke approved. Some things are hard to talk about, but silence gets us nowhere. We must speak and try to understand even when there's no hope. Thank you very much. Hope does not die. It moves into our hearts.
Thank you so much, Mr. Danilov, and thank you all for your contributions and also for respecting the time limit. It's really impressive how organized you are. I would like to say that we would like to ask you to speak a bit slower, especially those of you who read, because the interpreters find it a bit difficult to catch everything you say, and we want to make sure your entire message is interpreted. So please speak a bit slower. I would now like to give the floor to other human rights defenders to talk about their experiences, including the risks and challenges that they face. And the next speaker will be speaking anonymously under the name Mira Greenberg. She is concerned about her safety, and therefore we suggest that she doesn't turn on her camera. Please, Ms. Greenberg, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving an opportunity to speak out. I started getting involved in climate activism at the age of 16, which is quite early for Russia. We were brought up to be apolitical from an early age. So at that age, many people were just beginning to take an interest in politics. To this day, many of my peers didn't understand why systematic activism was necessary or its benefits. So I had very few politicized friends who could understand my pain and fear of activism in modern Russia. The post-war repression exacerbated this situation because many activists I know were forced to leave Russia while I stayed here. This often made me feel alone in the political field, alone within this system. I'm currently pursuing higher education, and there have been cases at my university where activists have been expelled for trumped-up reasons. Because of this, I often have to avoid expressing my opinion and engaging in discussions with professors who often tell us false information about climate change that contradicts accepted data. The university avoids many contemporary topics for discussion, including climate crisis, women and indigenous people's rights, politics, and even veganism. So when I graduate, I plan to go to a foreign university to make my work more effective and to be able to speak out. I have been actively involved in Fridays for Future in Russia since 2020, but it is hard for us to do anything now. The war has shifted the focus of opposition, and it's hard for people to think about the climate against the backdrop of these horrific events. In addition, the intensified repressions has made any street protests almost impossible, while the Fridays for Future format is designed to do just that. Nevertheless, I'm very proud of what we did to develop the climate agenda in Russia. I think it provided a good basis for continuing the discussion on climate in the future when Russia will be ready for it again. At the same time, I realized that this issue cannot be postponed because this decade is crucial in dealing with the climate crisis. Our climate lawsuits came at a very important and difficult time, and that adds to its value. We don't have time to wait for Russia to become a democracy, and nobody knows how long it will take. So we should look for ways to influence the Russia we have now, even though it is a difficult moral issue. When I joined this lawsuit, I knew straight away that we wouldn't win in the Russian courts, and I was very scared of being subjected to reprisals for doing so. But the very fact that we were not afraid to defend our rights in the face of a police dictatorship is already an important step. I don't like to end on a bad note, so I want to say that I'm very proud of us and our strength and courage. I'm grateful to everyone who has joined this lawsuit, our lawyers who have worked on it, and everyone who's helping us in this difficult case. We are an example of the kind of civil society the Russian authorities are trying to destroy, and it gives me the strength to keep fighting. I believe Russia will become free and climate neutral. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Ms. Greenberg. The next speaker on my list is Ms. Alexandra Koroleva. If you're ready to speak, the floor is yours.
Здравствуйте. Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые коллеги.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am highly appreciative of today's meeting because we're all spread out all over the place, but thanks to such meetings, we can unite, we can put our heads together. I work at Eco Defense. In 2014, after a successful campaign against the construction of a nuclear power plant in the Kaliningrad region, our Kaliningrad-based organization was put on the blacklist of foreign agents. This was an expected decision as soon as the Foreign Agents Act was adopted in 2013. And we've always known that sooner or later we would end up falling victims to it. We fit the definition of a foreign agent perfectly well as we received funding from foreign foundations and engage in politics, quote unquote, because an activity that runs counter the decisions of the authorities is recognized by law as a political activity. The campaign against the nuclear power plant interfered with the implementation of the state decision to build a nuclear power plant in the Kaliningrad region. As an employee of the Ministry of Justice wrote in the protocol, the Ministry of Justice put us on the blacklist. Anyway, so we managed to somehow win the case, but it was at the European Court of Human Rights. However, even the complaint was named after us. But the ruling was perfect, but it was too late. It was not just 9 years late. It was just a whole era, an eternity late. We believe that had that complaint been considered on time, perhaps the development of all Russian society would have taken a different path. So in 2019, I left Russia, burdened with 5 criminal rulings in a small backpack. At some point in time, we made a principled decision to act as if there had never been any law on foreign agents. We did not comply with any of the absurd requirements and so forth. It was like a guerrilla war. And in the meantime, we successfully worked for a full 5 years protecting the climate and the rights of citizens until the next round of reprisals. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 2016-17, Eco Defense managed to create grassroots civic movements against coal mining in Kuzbas. We managed to create, so never before in the history of this region had there been any large-scale environmental protests. In 2019, together with our partners of Team 29, we won a lawsuit. For the first time ever, a Russian court ruled that coal mining by a private company could not be justified by state needs, quote unquote, and cancel the license to develop a new field. In 2020, Eco Defense released a report raised to the bottom environmental and health implication of large-scale coal mining in Kuzbas is the title of that report that we presented. We included some shocking data on the environment and the report. Incidence of disease, mortality in the Kemerovo region. That same year, residents of the village of Cheremza and several neighboring towns organized a protest camp and held the area allotted for the construction of the coal loading station for an entire summer. They survived police raids of the camp, searches, detentions, arrests, and hunger strike. Unfortunately, in 2022, several Kuzbas eco-defense activists were forced to leave Russia against the backdrop of this war in Ukraine, like activists from other organizations as well. since 2017, I have been the project monitoring local phenomena of global climate change in the Kaliningrad region is the title of this project. The most important task of the project is to create and keep up and running a public discussion platform on climate change. The project is implemented by a brilliant cohort of scientists and experts who are now the Kaliningrad team of eco-defense now. They did not leave Russia. They did not want to leave Russia, in fact, although the new amendments to the law on foreign agents make it possible for the government to take repressive measures to those who have some kind of relation to a foreign agent organization. For almost 15 years, eco-defense has been monitoring the UN climate change debate. Our goal is to inform the civil expert and the journalistic community in Russia about the political process. Our observers produce the newsletter below too. And like I said, we did not comply with the law on foreign agents, and we have been fined on a regular basis, all in all. Those files kept piling up, and 5 criminal cases were launched against Koroleva Alexandra, for example, myself, right? So enforcement procedures were launched, and also accounts were frozen. The penalties under the relevant article in the criminal code include imprisonment for up to 2 years. So not willing at my age to experience the Russian prison system. Last year in June, instead of going to bailiffs for an interrogation, I took a bus from Kaliningrad to Klaipėda, Lithuania, and later in June and flew to Germany, where 6 months later received the status of political refugee. So all of this experience that we have gained has made it possible for us to start a new project. Stop Russian War Machine is the name of the new campaign that we launched in Germany with the aim of making sure that sanctions against Russia, particularly those who produce coal, other fossil fuels, for them to be, for those sanctions to be increased against them. Rosatom and this 10th package of sanctions hopefully will also include some sanctions against Rosatom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Koroleva. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Dmitry Makarov.
Madam and Mr. Special Rapporteur, dear colleagues, I represent the Moscow-Helsinki Group, the oldest functioning human rights organization in Russia, that now, for the second time in its history, faces the risk of being closed down. On January 25th, the Moscow City Court will start looking into the claim by the Ministry of Justice that we have committed grave violations by engaging in activities outside of Moscow. The ministry claims that as a regional organization, we have no right to do so, and that this warrants liquidation of a legal entity and basically prohibition to do anything under the name of the Moscow-Helsinki Group. Our mandate from the start has been monitoring and reporting on human rights violations, first in the Soviet Union and then in Russia. Despite Moscow in our name, the group has always worked to promote human rights and support civil society throughout the country as well as internationally. The violations that we are charged with are connected with trial observation, with appeals to regional authorities in defense of freedom of assembly, with participation in awareness raising and human rights education events. In short, legitimate human rights activities that any responsible state has an obligation to support. I find myself among this group of activists because for the past few years, we have been working closely with environmental initiatives throughout Russia to react together to environmental issues and to the problems that the activists face as a result of addressing those issues. We find ourselves among the applicants in the climate case, and we cooperate with environmentally focused lawyers and human rights defenders both in Russia and abroad. Just like human rights, environmental issues are a matter of joint efforts across territories and across borders. Applying territorial limitations on those activities is not only absurd, but also abominable. I cite our case not only because it is a violation of our right to freedom of association and an attack on a human rights group. It is an episode in a consecutive series of consolidated efforts to make human rights work nearly impossible in Russia. The special rapporteurs are well aware of the consequences of the legislation on foreign agents and non-desirable organizations, but there are other prohibitive laws. Independent human rights defenders were pushed out of all institutions, public monitoring commissions, public councils, and so on. As environmental activists well know, the government is often ignoring appeals, systematically denying public consultations, and narrowing down the space where independent civil society voices are of consequence. Both human rights organizations and environmental groups are being forced to close, either by direct court orders, as was the case with Nobel Prize winner Memorial or the Russia-wide movement for human rights, or by their own decisions, as was the case with the renowned Sakhalin Environmental Watch or Environmental Movement 42 just recently. They are not able to face the risks and the burden that the government regulations place on them. And we argue that it's not a series of separate violations, but a concentrated attack on the independence of civil society, an attempt to undermine the whole system of human rights, and it should be treated as such. On our particular case, we sent an appeal to the special rapporteurs in which we ask for concrete steps, but we also ask for a change in the overall approach. Appealing to the government no longer works. There is no goodwill and there is no willingness to change. Basically, we need efforts to strengthen the capacity of the international institutions to deal with non-compliance, to deal with what may well constitute a crime against civil society. We are willing to commit to this type of approach, but should the UN institutions and the goodwill member states. We need to search together certainly for ways to help those that face persecution because of their human rights activism, but even more importantly, for ways to have them continue their crucial work. And the backing of the international institutions, regardless of a violated state attitude, is crucial in this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Makarov, for your contribution. And last but not least, Mr. Arshak Makichan.
Good morning. I started working climate activism in a different country. It doesn't exist anymore, at least for me. This was 4 years ago when practically no one in Russia knew anything about climate crisis and about the threats to our future, despite the fact that Russia was an official participant of all the talks on climate and agreements for the past 30 years. I found out about climate change by accident when I read about the strike that Greta Thunberg started, and I couldn't understand why nobody spoke about it in Russia. Then I started picketing every Friday, going with educational posters talking about climate change, and it was already frightening. Not just for nothing. In the first year, I was detained, then arrested for 6 days. There was also a man who threatened to cut me up at the picket, and police did nothing in order to apprehend the criminal, but they didn't like my poster, Strike for Climate. They never... Activists have been marginalized. The television denied science and global warming itself. Despite that, we have created climate movement, and there's a huge number of people in our country who have learned about climate change and this crisis and the necessary actions that have to be taken. Our hopes for any change were dashed in 2020 when a lot of media and also people who participated in single pickets started being added to the foreign agents list, because activism and extremism are now equalized in Russia. In 2020, I was detained twice. In 2021, the situation exacerbated, and even we, climate activists, cannot talk about Russia's climate policy. In 2022, those who don't picket anymore for our future are not picketing because people are arrested for absolutely everything. The majority of the environmental NGOs have either closed down or have been added to the list of foreign agents. I have had to leave Russia because I was followed. On the 25th of February, I was detained when I was leaving my home, when I was only seeing my girlfriend off. And I realized that if I stayed in Russia, I would spend my future in prison. Now I'm safe and sound, but every day I read the news about my friends in Russia being tortured, being detained, and recognized or labeled foreign agents. I have been deprived of my opportunity to return to Russia. In May, a case was started to abolish my Russian citizenship, and there was a huge campaign unleashed in the internet against me and my family because of our Armenian origin. So I have been deprived of everything, but also my family has been repressed and persecuted, although they have got nothing to do with my environmental activity. On the 25th of October 22, the court ruled to abolish my Russian citizenship and the Russian citizenship of my country. It is terrifying, terrifying not just for me, but for my country, for my family, for my friends and our future. My country doesn't recognize me, but I cannot deny my own origin and my citizenship. There is no climate policy as such in Russia. We cannot monitor the emission, and we cannot be involved in environmental activism in our Russian reality today. Today, environmental activism is not welcome in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Makichan, for your important contribution. In the remaining 20 minutes, I'm going to hand it over to the special rapporteurs to respond to some of the things that have been said or ask questions if you have questions. Madam Lawlor, over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. It is really quite harrowing to listen to you and the difficulties that you have faced, and the fact that so many of you have had to move and find yourselves in very uncertain and fearful situations. There's so much information in this, and I didn't get everything, so I will be trying to study the notes after this meeting. I have looked at all your questionnaires, those of you who did them. I have a few questions, and then I'm going to turn over to Special Rapporteur Fry, because I reckon there's so much more that he might want to discuss with you. For me, my mandate is the protection of human rights defenders. So for those people who are currently experiencing any kind of risk attack, that's what I can take up. I can take up, for example, Mira, you are clearly at risk in Russia, and I would like to hear more afterwards through Anastasia about the specific incidences for you in the university. Also, Tibrock, I would like to hear more from you as well afterwards. And Dmitry, I just want to ask you, when you talked about, because we're always trying to think of what we can do. And as you said, traditionally, the rapporteurs write to the government about their concerns and follow up with the government. But as you say, there's absolutely no point in writing to Russia at the moment. And you are talking about a different way of trying to ensure some sort of progress in the struggle for human rights. I would like to hear a bit more from you as to your idea, because I didn't quite get it. And I'm not even sure when the new rapporteur on Russia is appointed, how much the mandate will allow them to work outside of the system, but it's something we need to explore exactly as you said. What is the best strategy? Because we're failing on it. There's no doubt about it. And then I would like to hear more about many of you in your questionnaires made reference to the specific situation of women human rights defenders and the additional risks that they face. I'd like to hear more about that, and also the reprisals, because reprisals and the whole area of business and human rights is a priority for the mandate. So these mining companies, these open coal mines, these oil companies, are these state-owned? Are they privately owned? You know, what is the link there? How can we work a bit more on exposing the harm that defenders are facing because of their work to prevent, I suppose, harm to the people who are affected by the mine when there is no free, open consent. So they're the kind of things that I am interested in, but I'm going to hand, and also Arshak, with your citizenship revoked, where does it leave you now? I mean, and some of the others who have had to flee and or find themselves in different countries, you know, the uncertainty of your legal status. It's not something I can take up because it's outside of my mandate, but I would like to know, you know, whether or not if there is some support, you know, through acknowledging you or anything like that, that could be helpful. I'd be happy to do that. So I'll hand over to Special Rapporteur Fry now, because I reckon he has a lot of questions.
Thank you very much, and may I also offer my, you know, heartfelt congratulations for all the hard work you've done in this case, and offer my sympathies for the very difficult situation you're in. I just can't imagine the circumstances you're having to deal with in such a terrible time that we're in at the moment. With respect to the climate change issue, clearly you have a very strong case about the actions of Russia, or the lack of actions by Russia to address climate change and their obligations under the Paris Agreement, and not meeting those obligations. So, you know, it's possible that, you know, I could join with an amicus brief to join with your case if you thought that was, you know, a useful thing to do. Certainly, you know, if you can provide me with some background information, I can certainly, you know, work on that as part of my work. I'm also interested in seeing whether there are other legal options to deal with some of these companies that may have assets outside of Russia, you know, and that can be, you know, accountable, you know, outside of Russia, and explore whether there are options of dealing with that as well. And I was going to ask Dimitri in particular a similar question to what Mary had about, you know, what other options you obviously are clear about the sort of limitations of our position, but, you know, if there are other options you could think of, you know, we're quite happy to take them forward. You know, I'm quite friendly with the UN Secretary General's advisor on climate change, and if there are sort of opportunities to sort of bring that forward through the Secretary General's office, I'd be happy to explore that. But I'm just, you know, if any of you have any thoughts on what we could do, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Mary, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just also wanted to just ask Vitaly. I forgot to just ask Vitaly about you in your questionnaire. You talked a little bit about women's rights and the deprivation of parental rights, and that is also something that I would hope to learn more about. But just to reinforce that my mandate is one on protecting those who are protecting human rights. So all of you, but I need to, in order to do something, whether it's publicity on the website, whether it's doing a communication, but we really need to talk to Dimitri about your ideas, because we get nowhere with the Russians. And yeah, so I just wanted to add that in. I don't know if any of you want to answer some of my questions now or Ian's questions, but yeah.
I suggest that maybe, so we have about 10 minutes to answer the questions, and we have about 6 big questions that are worth addressing now. Dmitry Makarov, if you want to answer with regard to what the UN can do differently, how the system and how the strategy supporting defenders and acting on climate change can be improved. I think we should hear from you first, and then we'll go ahead to others.
Yeah, I'll be brief, but we all understand that it's just the beginning of a possible discussion, and I understand well the limitations of a mandate and also limitations of a system. My call was to actually look for allies within the system. For a long time, we have been advocating, for example, that the member states support the special rapporteurs by, for example, funding Russian-speaking staff. So the capacity to deal with applications coming out of Russia of the special rapporteurs would be increased. This is a small step. It does not take too much, but even in that we struggle. So perhaps we can use the cases, a number of cases that are mounting out of Russia, as to raise similar approaches. So, I mean, for me, it's, I mean, even the closing down of the Moscow-Helsinki group is a pretext to think, how do we deal with the incapacity of international institutions to do something with the states that are kind of ignoring the system altogether. So my call was to look for allies and to form, I don't know, the platforms and places where we can think of approaches outside the box. I mean, your amicus curiae intervention, either in the climate case or in the case of closing down the leading human rights organizations, would be of help. It is within the mandate, but perhaps there are some things that we could think that do not necessarily fit right in, but are needed in order to influence the situation. So I don't know if that helps to answer, but we are thinking in that direction. If more concrete ideas come, we'd be happy to share. But our call is also help us to find platforms where those ideas could be born in common discussions of various actors.
Okay, Dmitry, thanks very much. And just in terms of the Moscow-Helsinki group and its case and closure, what exactly would you like us to do?
Well, I think amicus curiae would be one obvious response, but also once more, as I said, it's a question of framing. Once more, and as I try to point out, we can frame it as a separate violation of freedom of association on an attack of human rights defenders, or we can frame that the Russian state is ignoring its obligations in their entirety. And I think we're up to the point that that's true. The special rapporteur in Russia is not going to correct that. No, the thematic rapporteurs are not going to correct that, but at least they can frame it. So, but it's, in a way, it's raises to a level of a certain crime, not against humanity, but against civil society. And if we start framing it like that, it also helps us to elevate the importance of the issues and also to look for other ways to influence that in a political sphere. I don't know if, I mean, I don't want to take up that too much time, but thanks a lot for considering it. And I hope there'll be more space for it.
Anastasia will follow up with you afterwards. Because, as you say, there are a lot of people here, and also I'm not a lawyer, and she is. So I see hands up now. So let's just in order of who I see. Vitaly first.
Thank you for the question, Madam Rapporteur. Yeah, I would like to respond to two aspects. First one, the situation with the so basically yeah, and I would say in general that I tried to cover a little bit of what we are seeing. Of course, we have much more examples and cases and data, and we will be publishing soon our annual report. So we also will be happy to share that with you as well. But to specifically say that, yes, we are seeing examples when the threats to the single mothers, environmental defenders, threats of deprivation of them from parental rights. So that's one of the specific things that happening and really scares mothers and parents in general. That's one thing. And another one is that specifically in the area of business human rights, as I said also in my speech, environmental defenders are facing not only the authoritarian state, but also the concentration of economic power. And we also understand that in the current growth-oriented economic system, it will be also with the so-called green economy, etc., it will be only increasing. So that's extremely important that we're looking not only to the specific oppressor, but also to the drivers of these violations. And I think we would like to have more investigations toward the drivers behind all these violations. We can say we have a special report on the activities of Rosatom in this area. We documented examples of Rosatom's destructive activities and also violations towards environmental defenders that we published that a couple of years ago. So that's an important area, and yeah, there's other corporations that we are seeing the similar pattern, and that should be specifically more investigated. And also, this is talking about the kind of perspective steps or what could be also done. And as part of the Friends of the Earth Federation, we call into the binding treaty on business on the transnational corporations, because we also understand that it's impossible to deal in the frame of one jurisdiction with the company.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you short, Vitaly, because there are lots of hands up. So I think, oh gosh.
Alexandra Karolina was the next one to raise their hand. I'll help you, Mary.
Thanks. I looked just.
Thank you very much indeed. I have a proposal to Ian Fry as the advisor to the UN General Secretary on climate issues. So there's a need for an all complete international support with regard to sanctions to be imposed on Russia with regard to such economic entities that bring revenues to the coffers of Russia that is used to wage war against Ukraine, and also to organize reprisals against Russian people. So we are looking for allies outside of the European Union, not only, so this would be very helpful, sir, for us to work both in the area of climate change and also with regard to those who had to leave Russia, human rights defenders and eco-activists who have stayed in Russia and are being subjected to a lot of reprisals on the part of Russia. And at the end of the day, it will help end the war.
So we have less than 5 minutes and 4 raised hands. So I'll give the floor to Dmitry, then Dariana, then Mira, and then Arshak, in the order in which you raised your hands.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to highlight a couple of short issues. First of all, about the, I would like to ask to be against lobby of Russia and Rosatom, which try to lobby nuclear power as a green energy for solving climate change on international level. As about the foreign assets, it's a very interesting, a good position, because, for example, Nornickel right now still sell products, and about I don't know, but about 30% of the, for example, Germany export of nickel is going from Nornickel right now. Even we have war, when we have sanctions. And I think it'll be very good if we work together to create a list of companies which violates human rights, indigenous people rights, and climate issues in Russia, and then start to discuss how the West could influence through Western companies, through Western business on these companies to follow the international standards on human rights in Russia. As about the gender issues, latest tendency we notice that the state is very frightened men because, for example, through mobilization, they can send them for the war, and now the burden of protest against some actions or against state actions is going to the women. We have women protest against mobilizations in Yakutia, in Tuva, against the war, and it was repressed by authorities very hard. But at the same time, we have similar tendencies with regard to environmental issues. When indigenous men, they didn't participate public hearings in the villages because they are afraid, they're busy for the hunting and fishing. And a lot of indigenous women sometimes have more time to participate in such public hearings. And also, I would ask you to pay attention to Sergei Kichimov case. We prepared the letter to you as a special reporter on his case because he right now repressed by Surgut Neftegas Oil Company and state for his activity against the oil pollution in Khanty-Mansiysk okrug.
Have you sent that letter? Have you sent that letter?
Not we are sending it right now. I mean, we prepared
it. Just so I know in case I missed it, in case we missed it. Okay.
Over to Dariana Griznova.
I would like to highlight that third-party interventions is a powerful tool, especially if they come from the special rapporteurs, and they're very much valued by the European Court. Therefore, thank you, Mr. Rapporteur, for this generous offer. Our legal team will get in touch in the nearest future. We aim to submit the application to the European Court within the next couple of months. And it would be great if it could be a joint intervention, for example, from you, Special Rapporteur on Environment and on Indigenous people. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Mira Greenberg, please.
It's me, yes. Madam Rapporteur, you have asked me about the situation at my university, so I can briefly explain it. I'll answer in Russian as my English is not fluent enough.
Currently, what happens is that I'm study at a basically state-funded university. For the most part, this university is funded by the government. Due to that, this university is forced to comply with the governmental policies, which affects considerably both students and faculty. Oftentimes, our students have been expelled because they took part in some street protests in support of Alexei Navalny in 21 and also anti-war protests in 22. So some students that took part in those protests were kicked out of the university, which of course illustrates what kind of pressure is now being put on the youth, on Russian young people in Russia, so depriving them from getting access to education, to good jobs, and their parents have difficulties. Having them enrolled in private universities because the fees are high, tuition fees are high. Also, some faculty members have been fired on their anti-war because of the anti-war position. Most of the time, those were professors who taught humanities.
I also experience situations when there is a lot of disinformation by our lecturers about climate change or some environmental issues, environmental situation in the world, but I don't have any mechanisms in order to impact or influence them because the university cannot change lecturers just like that. And my opposition and my conflict with any lecturer would actually lead to the deterioration of my relations with them, and I would risk dismissal. So in order to stay at the university, I don't have any choice. I only need to look for ways of coexisting for me not to be removed from my studies.
So we have run out of time, but I would like to give maybe 30 seconds to Arshak Makichan to address the question to him, and then we will wrap.
Yes, in answer to your question about the risk with my citizenship, my family and I, we are without citizenship, patriots. So on the 25th of January, they're going to be considering our case, and it needs to be considered at the international level what to do for people without citizenship. There'll be more people like ourselves because of the actions of the Russian government. The case is going to be considered on the 25th of January, but I would like to see some solutions being found on the international level for people like ourselves.
Thanks very much. I would like to thank all human rights defenders for your participation and for the information you've shared with us today. I would also like to emphasize that I will send everyone an email address where you can send any additional information. It's clear that the time for questions was not enough for all of you to speak, and we haven't heard, for example, much about the gender issues from women present. So we would like to hear more about that and about the reprisals and about specific cases that you raised. I will follow up with you. I would also like to thank the special rapporteurs and the media present, and this hearing will now be adjourned. Thank you.